Everyone needs to care about this because metabolism and metabolic health, it is the core foundational layer that all health is built upon. That is the biggest blind spot in Western healthcare, is that our drugs and our surgeries and our specialists are not treating that trunk of the tree. They're playing whack-a-mole reactive medicine with the downstream symptoms of that core process. Step 1 is mitochondrial dysfunction. Step 2 is insulin resistance leading to high insulin levels, but glucose stays normal. And step 3, far down the road of metabolic dysfunction, is both insulin levels and glucose levels are high in the blood. The reason we're eating ourselves to death, literally in the United States, in the Western world, is because our bodies aren't actually getting what they need. And so they're driving us to eat insatiably in hopes of the cells getting what they need to function properly. We literally 3D print a new version of our body every single day. The body we had 5 years ago is molecularly completely different than the body we have today. We are dynamic processes. And the beauty of that is that we can constantly improve.
Casey, for somebody that wants to dive deeper into this realm of metabolic health, assessing where they're at on that spectrum and then optimizing, how do you recommend they begin?
You know, Jesse, I think the first step is to really start basic. There are literally 6 biomarkers that we can get for free, generally, on our annual physical that our doctors will not fight us about, that can give us a snapshot of sort of the basics of whether we are in the right spot on the metabolic spectrum. So that's where I would start. Of course, the sky's the limit with lab testing and biomarkers, but just getting a fasting glucose, triglyceride, A1C, HDL cholesterol, blood pressure, and waist circumference, those right there can be super, super helpful. So when you actually look at the data that's come out from the American College of Cardiology as of 2 years ago, 2022, if you met the optimal criteria for those biomarkers, you were part of just 6.8% of, this was Americans, but of Americans who met optimal criteria for metabolic health. So what I would do for people listening is just like get your results from your last annual physical, look up to see if you got these labs, and you want to look for fasting glucose under 100, triglycerides under 150, A1C less than 5.7%, HDL above 40 for men or 50 for women, waist circumference less than 35 inches for women and 40 inches for men, and blood pressure less than 120 over 80. And also they looked at total cholesterol over HDL cholesterol of a 3.5 to 1 ratio. So those are cumulatively maybe $100 of tests if you pay out of pocket, but often free. And that will tell you whether you're in that 6.8%. And so every single person should really know where they stand just on those basics. And then from there, tons more tests you can do to get richness to the metabolic health picture, but I would have everyone start with those.
You mentioned that number 6.8%, which is just staggering. Do you feel like in the last couple of years that's gotten better or worse?
It's getting worse. It's actually getting worse pretty much every single year. And it's especially going up in children. The worsening rates, we're seeing that in the US right now, about 30% of teens are now pre-diabetic. So that is something that probably an endocrinologist may have never seen 50 years ago, like a kid who has acquired blood sugar problems. This is different than type 1 diabetes. This is the road to type 2 diabetes in teens. So it's really, this is this constellation of blood sugar problems, metabolic problems, mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, all kind of synonyms for the same thing. It's absolutely just ravaging our population at unprecedented rates, and there's really no signs that it's getting better. So this is why, of course, the message of the book and what you're doing and so many other people in this space are doing is we gotta get on top of this for ourselves, because unfortunately the system right now is not incentivized to focus on underlying metabolic root cause foundational health. So we need to really understand for ourselves where we stand and then take the steps to really optimize it. And actually, just to highlight how it has worsened over the past few years, I think COVID, of course, it was a big hit because people were at home and the gyms were closed and whatnot. But there was a study in 2018 from UNC that showed that 12% of American adults were metabolically healthy. And then in 2022, a study with fairly similar biomarkers that we're looking at showed that it was 6.8%. So that's a big jump in just 4 years.
Well, now we know how to test. We know it's a major problem for a lot of people, at least in the US. And we're assuming that would extrapolate to, a lot of the Western world. Let's get into some of the physiology of why that's a problem. Why should people care that this is happening?
The simple way to think about it is that everyone needs to care about this because metabolism and metabolic health, it is the core foundational layer that all health is built upon. So it's kind of that thing of it's the gas in the car. And so no matter how fancy your car is, how many bells and whistles, if there's not gas, it will not run. And that's what our metabolic health is. So people might think of metabolic health as like another issue, another disease that we need to think about. But actually, the reframe is that it's foundational to pretty much every disease we're seeing in the chronic Western world. So in our system right now, we're very focused on like each disease is in its own little silo. Arthritis is in a silo, and you see one doctor for that, and cancer's in a silo, and dementia's in a silo, and fatty liver disease in a silo, and obesity's in a silo, and type 2 diabetes is in a silo, and depression's in a silo. And you, of course, would see different doctors for all those things. When you actually look at the true science and the true physiology of what is the cellular biology that's leading to a lot of these diseases we're seeing rise in rates in the Western world, the trunk of the tree of all of those is this metabolic dysfunction, which is fundamentally an underpowering of our cells. Just like any car, any machine, any factory, any city that is doing complex work, if it doesn't have power, if it doesn't have energy, it will malfunction. And so because we have 200 plus different types of cells in our body, we've got our retinal cells and our endothelial cells and our liver cells and multiple different types of brain cells, underpowering a core process, metabolic dysfunction in different cell types can look like different things. And in our Western system where we silo everything, we treat them as different things. But the news that people really need to understand, and what I really hope and envision for the future of the healthcare system, is that we actually start looking at these diseases based on their core cellular physiology and what's going wrong. And what we'd find then is that we actually have much less to treat if we treat the true root causes, which in many cases is metabolic dysfunction. So many of these downstream symptoms, which are basically the result of underpowering showing up in different cell types, would melt away. That is the biggest blind spot in Western healthcare, is that our drugs and our surgeries and our specialists are not treating that trunk of the tree. They're playing whack-a-mole reactive medicine with the downstream symptoms of that core process, which is why we're already spending $4 trillion per year in the US on healthcare, and outcomes are just getting worse. We could spend $20 trillion on this approach of whack-a-mole reactive medicine. We're not going to get healthier as a country. We just have to redirect those resources towards the real problem that's happening inside the cells, which is the metabolic dysfunction. So that's why everyone needs to care, because all symptoms, all diseases they have to be the result of cellular dysfunction. This is so funny because it's not even something I learned in medical school. It's like, it makes sense though. Like if you have a symptom and if you have a disease, we're 100% made of cells. So it has to be the result of some dysfunction in cells. So really medicine should be always focused on what is causing that dysfunction and what is the dysfunction. That's not how we practice medicine. We just describe diseases based on their symptoms and we try and ameliorate the symptom. So necessarily the pain that we're feeling, any suffering that we're feeling in our lives is the result of cellular dysfunction. Now, what I would recommend to people anyone who does not have optimal health, the exact health they want, limitless health, feeling incredible every single day, any symptoms, I would recommend they go down the route of examining their metabolic health, because now 93% of Americans have dysfunction. So it's not to say that all depression is caused by metabolic dysfunction or all arthritis is caused by metabolic dysfunction. But for 93% of us, that is one of the causes of dysfunction in our cells. So we have to basically all investigate it. And the beautiful thing is we can understand it with biomarkers and we can improve it rapidly. So I just think that literally if people are dealing with any symptom, it is a route to investigate, because it may be a knob you can turn, which can make your symptoms better.
And the fact that all this comes down to a common root, I would argue, is a really good thing. Can you imagine if, as individuals, we had to go to the doctor and have all the different, you mentioned the different types of cells, investigated and then find out what ones are affected and then them having different causes, what's affecting them? The good news in all of this is the fact that it is a common root. And there only is a handful of really important inputs that we're going to get into that impact the root, that we can get in and reverse and prevent all these diseases.
Exactly. That is the great news. It is literally the great news. It's great news for patients, but you know who it's not great news for? It's not great news for the bottom line of the healthcare system. So that's why we're not hearing about this because, the $4 trillion of spending that's happening is literally predicated on us believing that it's more complicated than it is and that we do need to see the neurologist and the rheumatologist and the endocrinologist and the obesity medicine doctor and the MSK doctor. Like that is to make that system continue churning this engine, which is the largest industry in the United States, for that to keep returning, returns to the shareholders, we have to basically not believe that it's actually a lot simpler than we're led to believe. And so it's good news for us. The reason we haven't heard about it is because it's not good news for a huge, huge global industry. And so, that's really the message that we're here to share, which is that, you got to kind of figure this out for yourself and get on top of it.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. We talked about testing early on in the conversation and the importance of using those tests to objectively see where we are on that metabolic health spectrum. For somebody who's tuning in right now and they might not have recent blood work done and they just want to get started, obviously most of the people are affected by this. But other good news is the things we're going to get into are just these diet and lifestyle practices that are foundational for us as human beings to thrive. So you don't necessarily need to get the testing done. You can just start applying this. And then next time you get blood work done, you can assess where you're at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the lab testing is helpful to kind of know what our baseline is. And I think have some of that motivation to really implement these practices. But you're exactly right. Like the lifestyle and dietary principles that fundamentally are what nudge these core cellular processes towards function, those really can be applied by all of us, no matter whether we have the tests or not. And the beauty is, like, tests they're great and we have access to them. And that's a really exciting thing and, where we're at in human history. But we have this other incredible wealth of information that we can tap into, which is free. It's how do we feel? It's our symptoms. And so I think something so fascinating about our modern world that I think is tied up in some of these, poor incentives of healthcare, is that we have been, I think, as modern Americans, like, we're so busy. We're just so much of our value in our society, our Western capitalistic society, is about, like, how busy can you be? How fast can you be moving? How many people can you be in contact with at 1 second? How much are you multitasking? How much of a boss babe are you? All these things. It's literally like, this is your value. And so because of that, a side effect has been that we literally, I think, are in some ways can't even hear the signals our bodies are telling us. Like, I'm bloated. Like, what does that mean? When do I get bloated? Is it after certain meals? Is it after, how's my digestion today versus yesterday? How's my sleep? How are my joints feeling? How does my skin look? Like, how's my hair? Our body is literally telling us how the cellular function is doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if we choose to slow down and actually hear it and listen and not just, jam over-the-counter medications in our body to try and basically tamp down on symptoms. Like, you think about, what is CVS or Walgreens, these huge, big box stores all throughout, I'm speaking about America here. I know you're in Canada, but probably different brands, but these are just giant stores whose basically purpose is to take a hammer to all your symptoms. So not only are we so busy, we can't hear our bodies, we have a symptom and our culture is about, like, symptoms are intolerable. Smash it, smash the headache, smash the joint pain, smash the, neck pain, smash the reflux. There's a pill for everything. But, a real different vision is, what if we just listened to those and actually started to, like, see the patterns and slow down a little bit? So yeah, biomarkers are great, but, like, our bodies are constantly giving us free information. We have to listen. And that means actually setting better boundaries in our lives and slowing the heck down. Because, the system's trying to squeeze every ounce of profit out of us, both our time and busyness, and also, of course, our healthcare dollars. And, like, it's really our job and only our job as individuals to decide whether we're going to say no to that. And so symptoms, are one way to do that. Biomarkers are, of course, like a higher level. Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge in all this is the fact that so many people are sick. Coming back to that 6-7%, it's normalized in society that we're going to be sick and feel these different symptoms. So not only are we busy and probably pushing them aside, they've been normalized because when we interact with friends and family, they're likely going to be experiencing them too. And when people normalize these things, it can be easy to just push them aside instead of using them as a tool to get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, Mark Hyman calls it FLC syndrome. We're all walking around with feel like crap syndrome. And since everyone's in that boat, we just don't even know that it's a thing. And I think, really what our birthright is as these like spectacular bodies is actually to feel energetic, joyful, fulfilled, happy, high on life most days. Like that's what we should be striving for. And that's almost a vision that I think we can barely even talk about today. It's like it seems so out of reach, I think, like that could never happen. It can happen for so many of us. And so I think like that's just a message I want to share with people. Like the body is constantly rebuilding itself every single day. We literally 3D print a new version of our body every single day. The body we had 5 years ago, it is molecularly completely different than the body we have today. We are dynamic processes. And the beauty of that, the beauty of our true nature as humans that are constantly, billions of cells are dying every day and being reborn, is that we can constantly improve. And we can, even if we're in a dark spot health-wise, the body of a year from now can be completely different. And that's because of our true nature as processes. And I think another thing the Western system has done has really made us attach this idea that we're this static body. Like I'm Casey, I'm a thing, I'm alive, and then I die. That like couldn't be farther from the truth. We are constantly dying and being reborn, and we take in 70 metric tons of food in our lifetime that is literally, we take those atoms from the food and just reprint their bodies every single day. And, we shed our entire skin lining every couple of weeks and rebuild it, gut lining, et cetera. So the news is hopeful. Like we actually really can, even if we're in a dark health spot, move towards health. And that is such a beautiful aspect of our biology that is awe-inspiring that I think sometimes we have blinders on to because we're very attached to this idea that, we are what we are, and this is the card we've been dealt. And that's not true from a biologic perspective.
And the good news keeps on coming. We're saying all these good things, other than the fact that we've, as a society, gotten to this place where most people are sick. Other than that, acknowledging where we're at and being open and honest that we are in this position, that is sad. But other than that, it's all good news. This, again, the fact that we're going to get into these levers, and they're things that we can apply at home, and our body is dynamic and it's always rebuilding. So there's a lot of hope in this message, which is great.
Also, the biggest point of hope, I think, is that we literally got ourselves into this mess in like 75 years. Humans have been around for tens of thousands of years, behaviorally modern humans, many, many more than that, just in terms of, Homo sapiens. And it's like 75 years we've screwed this up. And two interesting things has happened. Life expectancy has gone way up in the past 100 years, in part because, or mostly because of acute interventions, sanitation, hygiene, antibiotics. We have figured out a way to help with things that are going to immediately kill us. Infant mortality was like 30% in like 1900. It was huge. So that's great. We should take that with us into the future. That's good. We're not rejecting any of that. Acute interventions, yes, amazing. But we have screwed up, our lifestyle and the way that our modern environment is affecting our cells over the past 75 years, basically since 30s and 40s onward. So like, we kind of just have to backpedal. Like this has been a big experiment in industrialization and medicalizing chronic disease. And the experiment has failed. Like we know that we're all sick as hell. Like, but it's not like it's been like, we know what's happened and what has changed in the past 75 years. And it's not that complicated, And so I think that's also the hopeful news. Like you're going to see the headlines that say cancer rates are going through the roof and no one knows why. Infertility is going up and no one knows why. That's not true because they're going up rapidly and we know how the environment has changed. So, I think a big part of this, invitation is standing on your own 2 feet and not letting, the environment and then the news cycle make you feel like you don't have the common sense that you need to understand what's going on, like you do. And so that's really a big message of the book is, we need to all just like kind of pop up and look around and see what's been happening and what the trends are, and then figure out how to backpedal a little bit so we can, protect ourselves so they can do their best work and give us a healthy and happy life.
For somebody tuning in who wants to take that invitation, plant their flag into the ground today and start to make the changes, let's start with what the biggest lever is and then go down from there and talk about how we begin to rebuild.
Yeah. So the biggest lever is food. For me, it's always starts with food because we are 100% molecularly made from food. That's the reality. We transfer food outside of us into the atoms that make up our body. And so there's just no avoiding the fact that since our cells are totally built from food, we've got to get it right. To just sort of name, I think, the other pillars that we want to examine and take stock of, we've got food, we've got our movement habits, we've got our sleep habits, we've got our emotional health and stress, we've got our exposure to toxins in the food, water, air, personal care products, homes, we've got our relationship to light, blue light, sunlight, and then we've got our relationship to temperature. Actually, temperature has changed a lot in the way we interact with temperature as humans as we've moved indoors with thermostats and heating. And so those are kind of the big levers that have changed rapidly. And of those, each of them feels like a little baby that we could have a whole episode about, but we can run through the high points of all of them. But food, it's just really unavoidable that we've got to get that right. And right now, our food system, and this is one of those things that has changed over the past 75 years, 70% of our calories are coming from industrially manufactured, ultra-processed foods. This is frankenfood that our body does not understand, that is unnatural, and which is confusing our bodies, damaging our bodies, and not giving our bodies what it actually needs to function. So on multiple levels, it's hurting us. So this has been a rapid experimental change in society. It has failed. And we know that it's causing disease. We know that it's hurting us. We know that it's hurting our children. So number one on food is moving away from the experiment of ultra-processed food and saying no to it and denormalizing it. If someone from 1920 or 1900 came into our culture now and looked at our grocery stores, they would not know what was going on. It's so different from what things were. We were eating, natural foods, more locally grown from good soil that wasn't covered in synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, so much more nutrient rich. That's what we need to get back to. And so the big message on food is we need to be giving our bodies the molecular information to function properly and to be built properly. And that means moving back towards unprocessed, clean food from good soil. So that's kind of the highest level of the food.
As you give that explanation, it kind of jumps out at me, the fact that when we're looking at food, there's the input aspect and feeding our cells and feeding our body what it needs nutrition-wise, and then avoiding the toxins. So for somebody, you mentioned ultra-processed foods, for somebody that's a new term to, talk about specifically what that is, because there's this gray area continuing to develop even in the health space where there's, classic chips, there's chips like kind of in a gray area, and then there's certain brands coming out with better options that are fried in avocado oil. And we could do this on and on with a lot of different products where there's this continuum and not necessarily everything in a package is bad. So let's talk about what that line is for you when we're talking about ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to steal this from Dr. Rob Lustig, who gives a great, very simplistic way of understanding the processing of food. So first of all, there is a classification system that has been created, which it's good to get familiar with, which basically is a spectrum of how processed a food is. And there's group 1, which is unprocessed or minimally processed. And this is what we want 100% of our food to really come from. There's group 2, which is processed culinary ingredients. So these are like salt, sugars, oils, things that get added to unprocessed or minimally processed foods to make them a group 3, which is a processed food. So a processed food is something that has been, in some way gone through processing, like cooking or mixing with other ingredients, like processed culinary ingredients, to create something new. And then ultra processed is where actually the food has been broken down into its constituent parts, like a starch. Like you take a whole grain and you get rid of the bran and the fibrous parts, and you just get the starchy, endosperm. And then you take that and you mix it with other individual components from food. So they've been broken down into these like parts and then put back together in a Frankenstein-like way to create something that has never really before been seen in nature. So if you take, this is the Rob Lustig example, you take an apple. So unprocessed is you walk up to an apple tree and you take an apple off the tree and you eat it. That's unprocessed. Nothing has happened to the apple. Minimally processed is that apple was washed and cut into slices and then, put in a little package and sold in the grocery store. That's minimally processed. The apple has not been changed. Nothing has been added or extracted, but it's been modified in some way. If the apple was frozen, vacuum sealed, blanched, and then, packaged in a can, but nothing added, that's minimally processed. Then you get to processed, which is basically if the apple were turned into applesauce. So it was cooked, it was macerated, it was, maybe some sugar was added to it, maybe a little bit of salt and cinnamon, and then it was put in a package. So not terrible, but still, not the same as minimally processed. And then ultra processed is that apple goes to a factory and preservatives, colorings, flavor enhancers are added and it's turned into an apple pie at McDonald's. Like that's the ultra processed apple. So maybe apple flavoring was added as well. So there's like a tiny bit of highly processed apple in there, but very far from the tree. And so we know that the more of your diet you're eating from that ultra processed category, the more likely you're going to get chronic diseases and, reduce lifespan. And the more you're eating from that minimally processed and unprocessed, the better you're going to do, because for several reasons. One is that the moment a plant is basically taken out of the ground or off the tree, removed from its life source, it starts degrading its nutrients. So you start losing nutrients once that piece of food is removed from its life source. That makes total sense, right? It's degrading. There's been studies looking at what happens to vitamin C concentration in each day after various vegetables have been pulled from the ground, and it just precipitously drops. So one of the reasons why unprocessed and fresher food is so good for us is because it's literally going to have more of the health promoting molecular information that your body needs to both be built from and also to, to function. And then the second piece is that once you process a food, a lot of the nutrients further get stripped off. So you're taking a food, keeping it away from its source for a long period of time, and then stripping more from it through processing. And then, of course, like you said, as you get to ultra processing, you add things to the food that can be damaging to our cells and create inflammation and oxidative stress and things like that, like these colorings and preservatives and flavor enhancers, emulsifiers, all these types of things get added to ultra processed food. So that's really why keeping it minimally processed for several reasons is good. And like you said, there are packaged foods that actually fit into the minimally processed category. And there's actually some processed foods which, can be part of a healthy diet. Ultra processed, never part of a healthy diet. But one of my favorite foods is flackers. So these are flax crackers that literally they come in a bag, they're made in a factory. But the only ingredients are whole organic flax seeds, apple cider vinegar, and sea salt. So that is a somewhere between minimally processed and processed food that I absolutely think is fully conducive with super healthy lifestyle. So really, I think the name of the game with all of this is if you're buying a packaged food, read the labels religiously and make sure that you understand and know every single ingredient in that product. Hopefully it has very minimal ingredients, 3 or 4, and doesn't have additives that we know are not conducive with good health, like added refined sugar, added industrial seed oils, added ultra-processed grains, and things like that.
Those last 3 you gave there, I think, are a really good way of assessing a product. You mentioned, sugar, refined grains, and seed oils. And seed oils seem to be becoming more and more of a conversation in the health realm, which is great because they're just so prevalent within the processed food realm, and they just do so much destruction to the body.
Yeah, I think what's really important for people to realize is that I think the debate around whether seed oils are a problem right now is like honestly, it's just a testament to how powerful industry is and confusing the conversation. Like these have become the number one source of fat for Americans. And they are not a fat that is helping us. So the reason they're not helping us is multifold. But one is that these ultra processed industrial seed oils like never existed throughout human history until very recently. Like if you Google, and I recommend everyone do this, a YouTube video on how canola oil is made, it is one of the most horrifying, disgusting processes. It's like basically industrial waste that we're eating. These things have to be these oils have to be chemically extracted with often toxic chemicals like hexane, de-waxed, bleached, heated to super high temperatures, and then they're put in a plastic bottle, that sit on shelves for years. So obviously the production process, not great, but they're very high in omega-6 fats. And we know that when we need omega-6 fats for our health, but when we far overload the body with omega-6 fats as a percentage and ratio to the other type of fat that's very common in the diet, omega-3, what that does is it just really overwhelms the body with this pro-inflammatory fat. And that gets debated a lot. But I think one piece of information that's helpful for people to know that doesn't get talked about a lot is that omega-3s, which can basically be converted from plant-based omega-3s all the way down to EPA and DHA, which are the really biologically active anti-inflammatory versions of omega-3s that we know incorporate into cell membranes and that are part of the anti-inflammatory sort of resolving chronic inflammation response. To convert from these upstream omega-3s like ALA down to EPA and DHA in the body through a set of chemical reactions, it requires them to actually use all these enzymes in the body, these little protein machines called elongases and desaturases. And there's like 4 or 5 of them that upstream omega-3 from plants, alpha-linoleic acid, has to basically go through a several step process to get to the EPA and DHA that we really want. Well, something fascinating is that the omega-6 fats use the exact same set of enzymes to get to their downstream versions that are pro-inflammatory. So you start at the top with things like linoleic acid, upstream omega-6, and it goes through the exact same conversion process to make things like arachidonic acid, which is pro-inflammatory. So as you eat these seed oils, which are in everything, literally, it's almost impossible to find any packaged food at the grocery store without soybean oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, canola oil, vegetable oil, these industrial seed oils. You are essentially overwhelming the enzyme machinery in the body that could be doing work for you to create positive bioactive omega-3 fatty acids. You're blocking the activation site of these enzymes. So when I'm reading labels and avoiding the seed oils, I'm like, yeah, I'm freeing up enzymatic capacity in my body to allow all these plant-based omega-3s that I'm eating from chia seeds, hemp seeds, flax seeds, et cetera, walnuts, so that they can actually do the work in my body that creates, health. And so everything in the body, it's kind of a zero-sum game. And you don't want to compete. You don't want to out-compete these enzymes with things that are creating problematic things, as opposed to letting them have the capacity to do the work to help you feel healthier. So that's one of the big reasons I stay away from seed oils, is really just creating more capacity in my body to do the good work and not block it, with stuff that's not going to help me.
And the way I understand it, these oils aren't only being touted, well, they're not being touted as neutral, they're being touted as heart healthy. And they get a stamp from the higher ups in encouragement that these are good for us and we should be eating more of them.
Yeah, it's shocking. I think in my view, food is, like I said, food is molecular information. And we kind of know what our cells are built of. We know what our cell membranes are built of. We know what types of fats do like really helpful work in the body. And, I think we want to put more of those in. So I'm always going to focus on, more omega-3 fats and, really eliminating anything that's trans fat, of course, and reducing omega-6s as much as humanly possible, because just living in America today, you're going to be exposed to more omega-6s than we've, ever been before in human history, in part because even if we're primarily eating an animal-based diet, a lot of the animals are now just, instead of eating grass and the natural foods they're supposed to be eating that build omega-3s in their bodies, they're eating corn and soy, industrially, processed industrial grains. And so even the animals we're eating have higher omega-6 content. So we're overwhelmed. And a lot of it is just pulling back the density of that by being super thoughtful about reading labels. It's just so disproportionate what we're exposing our bodies to. And I think the bodies are very confused.
One thing you make really clear in the new book is that you're diet agnostic and you don't push one specific diet over another. Last time we talked, and it's been quite a while, you were heavily into a plant-based diet. In writing this book and continuing to learn the health realm, has that changed over the last little bit?
It's changed a lot for me. Yeah. About, 4 or 5 years ago, I was mostly plant-based. And, I think that as I've learned more, I've moved away from personally being plant-based. I think there's absolutely a way to have a metabolically healthy plant-based diet. But I think what I've come to really understand more is that a big root cause of why we're chronically ill at this point is that our food is industrial on every level, from the way it's grown to the way it's actually manufactured. And it's the industrialization of our agriculture system that is truly not only making the food system very fragile and not resilient, but it's also truly depleting the nutrients from our food. So just to give people a little bit of history, like over the past 100 years, for the sake of efficiency and food production, which, sound great, but it hasn't really worked out. We basically took traditional farming methods and said, we're going to just mechanize everything. We are going to spray the crap out of these fields with synthetic pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, which, by the way, these fertilizers that we're spraying come from fossil fuels, and we're spraying them all over the food and the soil. So we're killing a lot of the pests, quote unquote, but also all the biodiverse microbial life in our soil. And a teaspoon of soil should have trillions of microorganisms, which are literally there to alchemize sun and water and soil into nutrient-rich plants. But we just sterilized it. We killed it all for the sake of, pest control. So now we have food that doesn't have the alchemy in the soil to create the nutrient-rich food. So our food is actually even if we're eating a whole food diet, if it's grown in conventional soil that's using mechanized tilling, the fields are being used year round to produce as much as possible, but not having the sort of yin periods in between where the soil can replete itself, and they're being sprayed with synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, the food is depleted. And because that food is becoming our bodies, we are basically, a lot of the volume that we're taking in is actually doing so much less work for us. It's doing less in terms of giving us the nutrients we need to build the body and less of the nutrients for the body to function properly. So how this comes back to sort of like vegan and more omnivorous is that when you really look at what creates the healthiest soil possible, it's actually merging plants and animals into ecosystems together. So you have the animals roaming the fields that the plants are being grown, and not to be too graphic, but they're pooping on the soil. And that feces is literally filled with microbial life that reinvigorates the life of the soil. The nitrogen in their urine is super important for the nitrogen cycle in the soil. You've got their hooves gently agitating the soil as opposed to the aggressive mechanized tilling. And so there's this beautiful interdependency between animals and plants that ultimately is both really good for the animals and it's really good for the plants. Because then, of course, the animals are eating, around what we're growing for food. They're basically weeding the fields by eating this. And it's this beautiful ecosystem that we've broken with industrial agriculture. And when you take that sort of down the path, you kind of realize that humans are a part of that ecosystem too. So there's something around animals, plants, and humans in a beautiful interdependent ecosystem that is kind of as natural as it gets. And both the animals and the plants suffer when you separate. So that's kind of really reflecting on what is the most natural circle of life and ecosystem that we could possibly create. And what that brings you towards is much more of, I think, an omnivorous, balanced, system that is the highest quality possible food. So it's the essentially organic, regenerative, animals and plants. So I've moved from straight vegan to obsession with food sourcing and food quality, and only want to eat plants and animals that have been grown in a precious, pure, interdependent ecosystem that is sustainable and resilient. And because I believe that the food I'm putting into my body, if it's grown in a sustainable, resilient way that maximizes nutrient per gram, that is ultimately going to lead to a better body for myself by giving my body what it needs to function properly. So that's kind of what's moved me away. And I think I got pretty far down the path of animal rights and, animal cruelty and things like that. Like, hey, if I'm doing well on a vegan diet, why would I ever want to take the life of an animal? But the reality is that over 99% of our food in the country is grown conventionally, meaning with the industrial agriculture, the pesticides, the fertilizers, and literally nothing could be worse for biodiversity on our planet and holistic animal life than industrial agriculture. So, if you really back up and think about the amount of, we're facing a mass extinction in terms of biodiversity on our planet right now between bacteria, fungi, nematodes, small animals and birds. And a lot of that is driven by the conventional agriculture system, which is where a lot of our vegan food is coming from, especially the processed vegan food. And I think a lot less animals' lives would be tortured, and species ended if we actually focused on more of a traditional scaling, a traditional regenerative, sustainable food system that involves both animals and plants.
All right. So to read between the lines, it sounds like you've included more animal products because of the farming, the ecosystem, the holisticness of the practice of producing the food, and for the nutrition that you're getting from it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think a big part of the why we're sick right now is a disconnection. Our chronic disease epidemic is fundamentally rooted in disconnection. We've ignored the connection between the root causes of why we're sick. We've ignored the connection between human health and environmental health. And we've done a lot for the sake of efficiency, like, oh, just drug it. Oh, just eat the packaged food. And none of that's really working, because the reality is that we are, as humans, we're not separate from any of this. We are totally interdependent with all of it: the food, the water, the air, the animals, the bacteria, our cells. And the way forward, I think, for human health and planetary health is respecting the interconnectedness, which fundamentally on a bigger sort of spiritual level is kind of like transcending the ego that we know is the root of suffering, and realizing that we're all really interconnected, and then eating and living in a way that respects that rather than tries to outsmart it. A lot of why we're sick is because we tried to outsmart these perceived inefficiencies, like, getting sick, having a virus. Oh, we just have to manage all those symptoms. Or, oh, food takes a while to grow and prepare, eat processed food. But in trying to seek efficiency and convenience, we're actually breaking these key cycles that are required for our health. So to kind of, wrap it up, I think anything we can do to rebuild connection with all these different aspects of our fundamental life source, the food, the sun, clean air, clean water, is going to be helpful for our health. So it's really about respecting the connections and not ignoring them, as we've done out of, I think, human hubris over the last 100 years.
Last time we talked, I think your diet was around 95% plant-based. Are you open to talking about where that's at today and how it's evolved to where it is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say I probably eat, I still love plants, and the power of plants are incredible. The power of sustainably grown plants. So I'd say I eat about probably, I aim for about, 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal. And I'd say probably about 75% of that is coming from animal protein. I still love to get my protein from nuts, seeds, beans, legumes. But I'm eating, essentially my diet right now is all regeneratively raised meats. So elk, bison, venison, pasture-raised meat, pasture-raised organic eggs, pasture-raised, fully pasture-raised foraging poultry. I have relationships with some hunters. So I actually have like little bags of, venison that have literally, I know the person who has been out there. So that feels really, really good. And then I get almost all my produce from the farmers market. So relationships with farmers who I know are using good, soil practices. And that makes up a huge percentage of my diet. So just as many colorful, fresh fruits and vegetables as I possibly can. And then organics, nuts, seeds, beans and legumes, and as many spices as humanly possible. So that's kind of, just the mix, really just thoughtfully sourced, nutrient-rich whole foods that don't have synthetic pesticides on them.
You mentioned the fact that you focus on protein when it comes to having your meals. Why is that?
Yeah, so protein, I think, is such an incredible macronutrient because it's highly satiating and it has a high thermic effect. So it takes a lot of energy to actually burn the protein when you're digesting it. So you get kind of a lot of bang for your buck. And we know that actually in our gut, there's cells that are nutrient sensing cells that have these little cell receptors in the gut that can essentially taste and pick up different amino acids from protein. And when they touch those amino acids, they are going to secrete satiety hormones in the body, like on your behalf to help you feel full. And so, protein is really valuable because it's actually the stimulant that allows your body to make the hormones that reduce your cravings and make you feel full. And one thing that I think is so interesting in the conversation right now in the zeitgeist is like, we're talking so much about Ozempic and these GLP-1 agonists, and, we need to have more GLP-1 in the body. But I just laugh because our bodies are little GLP-1 factories. But the way that they become GLP-1 secreting factories to make us not hungry is these nutrient sensing cells of the gut, like the L cells, need to be stimulated with the right inputs. And one of those inputs, of course, is protein. And so that's how I think about it, really, is like it's both, this incredible piece of communication to my body that I have gotten sort of what I need and I can stop, eating. And that becomes effortless, right? Because once those hormones are secreted, it's not a choice. You're just like, you just feel full. I don't want more food. So that's great about protein. The second piece is that it's an anabolic stimulus for the body to build muscle and, store those amino acids in muscle cells. And I think being in my late 30s now, and really seeing what's happening with women's health, which is just like really on the decline. And a lot of that, I think, is because women essentially become frail because our hormones decline starting in our late 30s and then, of course, towards menopause. And one of the things that does is essentially make us weaker. It makes our bones weaker. It makes our muscles weaker. And so we have to respond to the natural declines that are happening in hormones by giving in other inputs that tell our body to stay strong and build. And one of those inputs is protein, which is going to stimulate some of the pathways to keep this metabolic armor of our muscle and our, strong, and let us be, warriors into our old age. And so I'm upping my protein more as I get older because I really want to make sure that I'm keeping my muscle mass, stable and hopefully building it over the years to counteract the natural declines that are going to happen.
All right. So prioritizing protein, mixed diet. Let's talk about meal timing. When do you typically break your fast, in the morning or in the afternoon? And how do you look at that and how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think about meal timing in two dimensions. The first is that meal timing is one of the three ways that we can help our body essentially know what time it is. So something really interesting about, I think, our chronic disease development over the past 100 years is that a lot of it, I think, is confusion about what we would call chronobiology, the body sort of knowing what time it is. We're diurnal animals, meaning that we have certain biologic activities that happen during the daytime and certain biologic activities that happen during the nighttime. And the body basically needs to be on this two-phase clock for us to be healthy. And part of that is natural. The body sort of knows due to clock genes and things like that, that it's day or night. But actually, a lot of our external cues help entrain those internal sort of clock pathways to know what time it is. The three main ways we can do that is when we eat, whether we're consistent with our bedtimes and wake times, And then if we see sunlight, during the day and get rid of the light at night, like those are the three ways we sort of have to tell the body it's daytime or it's nighttime. So part of meal timing is just about how do I tell my body we're in the active phase of the diurnal cycle and we're eating. So I try to eat most of my meals during the sunlight hours, basically. And try, but it's hard to eat them at fairly consistent times. So my body is sort of on a schedule and I'm not creating kind of mass confusion. If you think about the modern world, think about it. Like we don't go outside that much during the day and we have our blue light on during the night. So the body literally is just like, I'm so confused. It's sort of dark during the daytime and it's light at nighttime. Like what time is it? We eat our meals at totally erratic times. The average American is eating over a 15-hour window every day. So the body's kind of like, it's always the eating phase. Wait, I thought I was supposed to have a rest phase, but we're not giving it that. And then our bedtimes are super inconsistent. Typically in America, we'll bounce around weekends versus weekdays. Unlike children, we don't have a bedtime or a wake time for most of us as adults. So our bodies are in mass confusion chronobiologically, and meal timing is one of the ways we can support that. So I would say the way I think about it is like, how do I give my body a schedule? So usually that means eating my first meal around 11 a.m. or noon. I usually eat kind of a midday lunch snack around 2, 3, and we eat dinner around 6:30. And then I try and wind down the food for the night. So kind of a compressed eating window. And then the second reason, aside from chronobiology, that I think it's helpful to have kind of like a set eating window is because that gives your body a huge amount of time when you're not eating to lower the insulin levels, lower the glucose levels, and actually use any excess stored energy substrates in your body that aren't coming in by mouth. So that's when you give your body the opportunity to like not have to do the work to stimulate insulin secretion, and you get the insulin low. And that's when you start actually tapping into your fat burning and build the metabolic flexibility. So those are the two reasons. And I personally, right now in my life, am choosing to fast. I actually fast from Sunday night to Tuesday morning. My partner and I have been doing that for quite a while. So like a 36-hour fast once a week, which I do not recommend to everyone. But it's something that we just started as like a New Year's challenge. And it's actually something we've continued because there's something pretty amazing about, I prick my finger and I check my ketones and they can get up to like 1, I think it's millimole per liter by about that 36-hour fast. And at baseline, I'm more at like 0.2, 0.3. And I just love knowing that I'm bathing my cells in more ketones like once per week, because ketones are a very positive biologic signal to the brain and the body, anti-inflammatory and really like a regenerative molecule. And so for me, I'm really enjoying doing that to kind of get into that. And I find a different mental clarity by Tuesday morning, and I feel lighter. And I know I'm probably have churned through a lot of my liver glycogen. And for me, that's a nice reset that does not appear to be causing increased stress on my body. I think my lifestyle right now is fairly low stress, so I can handle that. But I would caution people, like, fasting is a stressor on the body. So if this is why you really need to personally evaluate if this is something that's either helping you or hurting you. But for me right now at this moment in life, it's helping me.
You talked about that benefit of the ketones and bathing your body in them once a week. It gets me thinking about hacking that in different ways throughout the week. Are you somebody that likes to have certain days where you're on a ketogenic diet to get there as well? Or hacking that through exogenous ketones, MCT oil? Or is that period that you're fasting enough for you in the week?
Yeah, I'm always thinking about, I don't, eat any refined carbohydrates or like added sugars. And so my body is typically, I'm not on a low carb diet, but the beauty about, we want to expose our body to ketones. And they're like, I think what you're getting at is there's lots of different ways to do that. And when I was vegan and I was on a somewhat higher carbohydrate diet, I was still able to get into ketogenesis because you can use these other tools. One of the most beautiful ways you can do it is maybe you're eating a slightly higher carbohydrate diet, which honestly can be really good for many women, not refined grains, but higher, plant carbohydrates. And then use intermittent fasting. So maybe a longer fasting window each night to just make sure you're kind of churning through some of the stored glucose and actually tapping into fat burning and creating ketones. So pairing slightly higher carbohydrate with longer fasting, intermittent fasting windows each night, maybe 14 hours or 16 hours, is a way to start building some ketogenesis in the body without actually necessarily going keto. Similarly, an extended fast can do that. So I'm certainly not on a ketogenic diet, but can make ketones by doing my extended fast once a week. And then, MCT oil is, another way that you can kind of give this fuel straight to the mitochondria to, create ketones. There's also exogenous ketones that you can take. I use the HVMN ketone IQ shots. I love those on my fasts actually, because they really cut through hunger. But the best way to really kind of figure it out for yourself, because there's no one size fits all, is to just buy a ketone monitor. I like the one you can get it on Amazon for like $40. It's the Keto Mojo, and it tests ketones, and you just prick your finger. And I think once you start to experiment a little bit, okay, like if I fast for 10 hours, what are my ketones in the morning? If I fast for 14 hours, what are my ketones in the morning? And if you're, I think, getting up to like 0.5, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, like that's your body's circulating ketones. And that's great, because if I eat birthday cake and some sugar or something like that, like my ketones will be 0 the next day. Like it is very clear to see how the diet and the fasting impacts it. So just buying a monitor and testing some of these different strategies out can be, I think, the best way to find like what works for you. So
you did hit the nail on the head though. I was just trying to assess whether you use different tools to get to that same state as you do in the longer fast.
It's flexible. Yeah. It's like sometimes it's intermittent fasting, sometimes it's extended, sometimes it's ketone shots. And then, of course, it's always eliminating the refined grains and refined sugars, because those are just largely going to kick you out of ketogenesis, and our body just doesn't need them. So
when you do this longer fast, did you say 36 hours?
Yes.
And what will you consume during that period? Just water, or do you have coffee, tea, certain supplements to enhance that period of time? I'm just curious. This is I didn't realize you were doing this.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an experiment, for me. Definitely don't recommend it for everyone, but it's what I do is just water. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of salt and lemon juice in the water just for some electrolytes. I take all my vitamins except for my multivitamin, because the multivitamin gives me a huge stomach ache if I take it not on an empty stomach. But I can take my fish oil, my curcumin, magnesium, zinc, and timeline urolithin A. None of those hurt my stomach. I think it's the B vitamins mostly in the multivitamin that make my stomach hurt. So I just take all my vitamins except for that. And then ketones. And then I take ketone IQ. I usually take 2 or 3 of those throughout the day, which totally cut through the hunger. And I'll drink some Spindrift sometimes, which has like 0 sugar and 5 calories. It's basically sparkling water with like a tiny, tiny bit of fruit juice. So a couple things here and there. And I do drink coffee, and I put just like a tiny bit of coconut oil, very little, or maybe like a tablespoon of milk. So I'm definitely taking in some stuff, but for me with the ketone monitoring, I can just track whether it's like working or not, and for me, I can still get up to like 0.8 or 1 millimoles of ketones, even with those things. Maybe I could get up to 1.5 if I didn't. And then of course, exercise is a piece of it too. If, we have a hike behind our house that we do almost every day, that's about 2.5 miles, kind of straight uphill. So if I do that during a fast, I can probably generate some more ketones than if I don't. And the one thing I'm probably just not going to do is lift weights on that day. So I love to take long walks and, just churn through more of those substrates during the fast. But I'm not going to do high intensity interval training or weightlifting, because I'm not repleting the amino acids or any carbs after that workout. So I feel like it's just less bang for my buck. But walks are super great.
You mentioned the average person having an eating window of, I think, 15 plus hours, which is super high. Talk about what's going to happen when people are doing that and constantly snacking, constantly spiking the blood sugar, the insulin, and what that does to metabolic health.
Yeah. So what that's doing biologically is that like each time you have an eating event, which we have an average of 11 eating events per day over 15 hours in the US, which is a lot. Every time you're doing that, you are going to be increasing blood sugar levels, most likely, and asking your pancreas to basically secrete insulin to put that glucose into your cells. So it's really overwhelming the body and making it have to do a ton of work just at these regular intervals without a break. And every time we keep our insulin and glucose levels going up in the blood, like we're essentially increasing our 24-hour exposure to these molecules in the bloodstream. And two things can happen with that. One is that constant exposure to insulin's an anabolic fat storage hormone. That's what it is. So it's not only shuttling the glucose into the cells, but it's telling the body we're well fed. We got to print some fat. So that's just pure exposure to a molecule that's saying store fat and don't burn it for energy, which most of us don't want, right? With 74% of people with overweight or obesity, that's not a state that we want in the body. So letting the insulin actually get low is literally taking the gas off the process that stores fat. So that's one issue. The second issue is that exposure to glucose throughout the day, kind of constantly going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, that is keeping the concentration of glucose in the bloodstream higher over a 24-hour period. And glucose can do a lot of different things. It can independently promote inflammation. It can independently promote oxidative stress, essentially like damaging free radicals in the body. And it can stick to things, which is glycation. It can stick to proteins, cell membranes, DNA, blood vessels. We don't want that. We don't want excess glycation because that is really what is causing a lot of dysfunction in the body, just sugar essentially sticking to things. And one of the most interesting, relevant, I think, examples of this process is when glucose is high in the bloodstream, it's going to stick to the most abundant protein in the body, which is collagen. And when glucose sticks to our collagen in our skin, it cross-links the collagen. And that's really one of the key root causes of premature wrinkles and aging, which so many of us are trying to fight with like creams and Botox. But like one key thing is just lower the total burden of glucose in the body. So those are kind of the reasons why we want to, I think, have these more discrete 2 to 3 maybe eating periods during the day that are discrete and which let our body respond to the glucose spike and then come back down and then have a break. And this has really actually been shown in the research that even if we eat, they done some research where you have two different groups and both groups are eating the exact same foods and the exact same amount of calories. One group is eating it over a 12-hour window, and one group is eating it over like a 6-hour window. So one's a long eating window, one's a short eating window, but the exact same food and calories. And the group that eats those calories in a shorter window has much better glucose, insulin, metabolic markers over 24 hours compared to the group eating it over a longer window. So we talk about like a calorie is a calorie, but that's not really true because calories eaten in different windows or at different times of day have a different biologic effect than if they're spaced out. So similar research has actually been done showing that if you give people the same meal in the morning versus late at night, they will have actually a lower glucose response to it early in the morning versus late at night because, again, we're diurnal animals. We're not really meant to be metabolizing a bunch of food late in the night. We're meant to be resting. And so the body's confused. So I think to wrap that all up, kind of front loading our calories more to the earlier part of the day, meaning, morning, afternoon, early evening. So not when it's, late into the evening when it's been dark for several hours, and trying to just tighten up the eating window, to a reasonable amount, 8 hours, 10 hours, 6 hours. Those are both things that can really help our body from a chronobiology level, but also just like exposure to insulin and glucose, throughout the 24-hour period.
And for a lot of people, this will be counter to what they've been told, where conventional wisdom says we want to be eating throughout the day to keep our metabolism stoked, and we want to spread out small meals, which again, the further we get into this, we're realizing basically everything we've been told and the way we've been doing things is backwards. Hence, 93% of us are metabolically unhealthy. So it all adds up. But we need to definitely get the word out on stuff like this because it's, again, not conventional wisdom that's even neutral on this. It's opposed.
Yeah. And I would say that for people who it seems like that's just too challenging right now, one gateway towards this, I think, is to just, if you are going to be snacking or snacking later at night, just trying to really make those things more on the ketogenic side, right? So like if I'm going to snack I'm going to, try and not spike my insulin and glucose basically. So there's so many snacks that can do this, like nuts, seeds, like a piece of chicken, an egg, things that are going to satiate me. And of course, just like drinking water too, because a lot of our hunger is probably just dehydration. But something that's more of like a protein fat predominant snack, so that I still, which is going to just slightly stimulate our insulin, but isn't going to kind of give us one of those little peaks in glucose that is going to really have a big spike in insulin. And not to mention those spikes in glucose, every time we spike the glucose, if it's a big spike, that also can make our mood and our energy levels change as well, because we know that when you come down from that spike, if you crash, if you have a big spike and a big crash, that's when people often feel that post-meal slump and maybe even jittery, anxious, brain fog, and actually have more cravings. So just getting off the glucose roller coaster with lots of snacks throughout the day and keeping things more stable is just actually just a great way to like feel better during the day. But if I'm going to have a snack, which of course sometimes I do, it'll be more of like a protein fat focused, snack, as opposed to, let's say, a banana on its own, which is going to be a very different biologic response to that snack than something more protein forward.
And to tie this back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the different metabolic tests. We talked about testing blood sugar. And an important piece we can bring into this is insulin resistance. And adding to that stack of tests we talked about before, fasting insulin, to catch your metabolic health starting to decline up to a decade or more even before you'd catch that if you were just looking at your fasting glucose. So talk more about that piece, the fact that insulin's going to be increased in the body over time, masking the effects of blood glucose.
Yeah. So this gets into really like sort of the next layer of metabolic testing, which, we talked about the first 6 or so tests in the very beginning of the episode, which I just feel like from an accessibility, cost, and importance level, we should all know where we stand on those: glucose, triglycerides, HDL, et cetera. But you're bringing up fasting insulin, which I, in the book, sort of say that's the next level. That is the most, I think that is the most important test we can each get for ourselves to understand our foundational health. Right now, I think if we had one test to get, it would be that one. The reason it's not in my first 6 that I mentioned is because it's harder to get. Because a lot of doctors are just like, no, we're not going to order that for you. You're young and healthy. That's not done in standard practice, which is just one of the biggest problems in healthcare. So, but if you can get it through a direct-to-consumer company, lab testing company, or your doctor will order it, get it. The reason is because of what you say. It can tell us about our level of metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, mitochondrial dysfunction, blood sugar dysfunction, all synonymous, a decade or more before those standard biomarkers are going to change. And so the reason for this is because when the body and the cells start to become dysfunctional from metabolic dysfunction, which is generally because our mitochondria, the cells that actually, or the part of the cell that actually makes energy and converts that glucose to energy, when those become damaged by our modern lifestyle. So the mitochondria can be damaged from so many different things: the toxins, the not moving enough, the not sleeping enough, the ultra processed food. Any of those things that are hurting the mitochondria basically stop it from being able to convert that glucose to energy effectively. And when that happens, the cell is going to be like, hey, the mitochondria is not working great. So we can't really take in more glucose to process to energy because the mitochondria is hurt by this modern environment we're living in. So it blocks glucose from coming into the cell, and it does that through insulin resistance. So the cell says, we're going to block the pathway that allows the insulin signal to come in and tell the glucose to basically be allowed into the cell because we can't process it. So you get insulin resistance because of the mitochondrial dysfunction. And then the body's like, yeah, okay, we understand that you can't take in the glucose, but we can't have this glucose just floating around in the bloodstream all the time because that's damaging too. So we're going to secrete more insulin to try and force the glucose into the cell. And that's essentially the high insulin levels that result from a problem inside the cell with mitochondrial dysfunction. So these insulin levels rise very early in this process, which are essentially a sign that the cell is overwhelmed and capacity is low to make energy. And it actually works for a while. That high insulin drives glucose into the cell. And so the blood glucose levels can look fairly normal for like a decade before the whole thing totally goes off the rails and the body can't overcompensate with high insulin levels anymore. And then you see both glucose and insulin levels high. So you basically, step 1 is mitochondrial dysfunction. Step 2 is insulin resistance leading to high insulin levels, but glucose stays normal. And step 3, far down the road of metabolic dysfunction, is both insulin levels and glucose levels are high in the blood. So you want to catch this at level 2, which is why you need to get a fasting insulin test. And in the book, I talk about how the range for fasting insulin that we really want to shoot for is about between like 2 and 5, 2 and 6 milli-IUs per milliliter. But what's crazy is that on the lab slip, it will often say that like less than 25 is normal for insulin. But when you actually look at the research, we want it to be much lower than that. If your insulin levels are already up to 25, that's actually a sign that your body's pushing out a lot of insulin, which may indicate essentially a problem with metabolic dysfunction already brewing. So we want that number low and tight. We want a low and healthy amount of insulin, which is a clear sign to us that our cells are not putting up an insulin resistant block. And so an example I give in the book that I think really illustrates this is like, if you and I, Jesse, both went in and got our blood sugar taken, and both of us came back with a blood sugar level of 85 milligrams per deciliter, both of our doctors would look at us in the eye and say, "You're doing great. Your blood sugar's in a great range. Congratulations." And you go home. But if my insulin level, which wasn't checked, is 30 and yours is 2, we are basically very biologically different, but we don't know that because we didn't test the fasting insulin. So if my fasting insulin's 30, that means my body is having to pump out 30 milli-IUs per milliliter of insulin to drive glucose into the cell to keep it at 85. But you're super metabolically healthy. Your body's only having to churn out a small amount of insulin to keep that glucose at 85. So without this additional test, it's really hard to truly know where we stand. Now, just circling back to the beginning of the episode, let's say you're not able to get this test and your doctor's not going to order it for you. We can look at, in those biomarkers, the basic biomarkers we talked about, the triglycerides, HDL, waist circumference, blood pressure, fasting glucose. What we'll often see with insulin resistance brewing is that triglycerides start to rise and HDL starts to go down and blood pressure starts to go up. So even if you don't have access to a fasting insulin test, if your triglycerides are creeping up, let's say your fasting glucose, like we were just talking about, is 85, but you're like, "Oh, I really want to know if I'm on that if there's early dysfunction." Well, look at your triglycerides and HDL and blood pressure and waist circumference, because those are all going to give you a clue about how your insulin levels are as well. Because if insulin resistance is at play, our blood pressure goes up. If insulin resistance is at play, our triglycerides go up. So you can kind of squint and get a clue of this with those basic biomarkers. But what's best is to get a fasting insulin. And just in terms of ranges, I mentioned in the beginning of the episode that what the criteria says for quote unquote optimal triglycerides is less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. I would actually argue that we really want our triglycerides to be like more like 40, 50, 60, 70s, like under 100 ideally. And so if your fasting glucose is 85 and your triglycerides are very low end of normal, so like 40s, 50s, 60s, that's a really good sign that your insulin levels are probably pretty low. So, so that's kind of the overview of fasting insulin and why it's so important.
As you're sharing all that, it gets me curious if they were to add fasting insulin to those 5 tests we talked about early on. We're already talking about, again, that 93% range of people that are metabolically unhealthy. Imagine if we added that in and we're able to catch all these early cases. Like, I can only imagine what the number would be.
It'd be so low. I think if the ranges were actually what they should be, and what I reported on this podcast was what the American College of Cardiology put in their paper. But if we actually looked at what all the research together shows for truly optimal levels, so they say fasting glucose less than 100. I would say fasting glucose between 70 and 85. they say triglycerides less than 150. I'd say optimal is less than 100. They say HDL above 50 for women. I'd say we should be shooting for 60 to 90. So if we actually looked at optimal ranges, I bet that number would be 1% of people who are optimally metabolically healthy. And if we added fasting insulin, I think we'd be getting down to the 1% level, which is just a testament to how much our cells are struggling in this modern environment, where everything about our lifestyle on every pillar has just changed so rapidly. This insulin resistance, this metabolic issue, it is literally the cells saying, we cannot handle the modern Western environment. It's not working. So it's pretty scary.
It is. And you mentioned the fact that when we get to one end of the continuum, insulin's going to rise and blood glucose. That's when we're all the way at the end and we're type 2 diabetic. So we can look at this like insulin resistance is starting, pre-diabetes, diabetes, and unfortunately, conventional medicine is only going to catch things when they're at the far end of that type 2 diabetes spectrum. Again, because the testing isn't done in a way to catch it early on.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think in some ways, the system has kind of infantilized us as individuals, saying like, oh, this is complicated. It's hard to understand these lab tests. And one of the big points, like one of the reasons I love podcasts like this, and one of the points I really try and make in my work in the book is that it's actually not that complicated. It's pretty basic biochemistry. And I actually think that everyone, including teens, can like understand what we're talking about right now, and like, and it's like we kind of have the responsibility now to understand 10, 15 biomarkers and what they actually mean about our cellular health, because we kind of just have to. Like, it's like the system's not reading the tea leaves of our tests for us the way our doctors, unfortunately, like, and I'm speaking as a doctor, are trained, is you see a list of lab results and they're either they're either red or green. It's like very algorithmic. This one's off. This one's not. This one's off. This one's not. And it's very much like, okay, if LDL is high, we need to bring LDL down, and if glucose is high, we need to bring glucose down. And if magnesium is low, we need to bring magnesium up. And it's like very kind of robotic. And like the vision I have for how we would train doctors is like, how do you look at all of these together as reading the tea leaves of, it's a tapestry of biomarkers that can tell us about how the cell is doing, which is ultimately all we care about. How is the cell doing? How can we make the cell happier? Because if the cells are happy in our body, we're healthy. And I think that every single person, basically high school biology or above, can understand that. And so that's really the message that I want to empower people with, is like, we got to understand these basic biomarkers for ourselves and then track them every few months until they're in the right range. And they can change rapidly. I've seen triglycerides drop 100 points in 2 months. I've seen glucose drop 30 points in 2 months. Simple diet and lifestyle changes that improve mitochondrial health will improve almost all of these biomarkers.
So you've shared quite a bit about your diet now, and you're somebody that's metabolically healthy. Somebody that's on the end of the continuum, say type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetes, how do you feel about them doing something more drastic, like a ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, really cutting the carbs down, even temporarily, to get that metabolic health back as a tool or longer term?
There are many people for whom that works really, really well. And an entire organization in the US, Virta Health, which has reversed a lot of type 2 diabetes, is focused on a ketogenic diet. The Diet Doctor organization, which has great content, is doing that. Ken Berry, Carnivore MD. There's a lot of people focused on that, and it can be a tool. But, a big message that I have is like, I am not here to tell people what strategy is the right strategy for them, because everyone's biology is different. There's two things that I think we know for sure. One is that we need to be eating unprocessed, real, nutrient-dense food. Like, step one for anyone, whether you're vegan or carnivore, is eat unprocessed food, ideally grown in good soil without the toxic stuff sprayed all over it. That's step one. Literally don't care if you're vegan or carnivore, eat high quality, real food. 2, track your biomarkers every few months and see if you're moving in the right direction. Is your insulin dropping? Are your triglycerides dropping? Is your HDL going up? Is your blood pressure going down? And if the answer is yes, I would recommend probably continuing that strategy until they're in the right range. But I can't tell people keto is the right diet for them. I can tell them that real food is the right diet for them and to track their biomarkers. And frankly, I don't think we should trust anyone who tells us a particular diet strategy to do, because there are people who are not doing keto, who are doing 100% whole food plant-based and slashing their insulin levels. So I'd say out of all this research and writing a 400-page book on this topic, those are the things I can tell you. Eat real food, not covered in toxic crap, and measure your biomarkers every few months and track your symptoms to know if it's working and make adjustments if it's not. And you will know. Like it will, if you commit, like things will change and you will have a sense. So that's kind of the main things I think. Yes, absolutely. There are people for whom a hardcore keto diet is working wonders on their health. I don't think that's necessarily a strategy for everyone. And yeah, the commonality is moving to a higher quality unprocessed diet.
All right. What I was getting at specifically, though, is just the urgency.
Yeah.
Like somebody who has a chronic disease and they really need to kick things into high gear and they might not necessarily have the time to do it in a slower fashion, whether it be, their metabolic health as a whole or a specific disease, cancer, yada, yada. What I was getting at is just specific tools such as going really low carb. We could bring fasting in. We could bring different tools in that somebody who's really trying to radically bring themselves down quickly because their metabolic health is so out in left field.
Yeah.
Just trying to give them some different ideas that might help. Me and you are in a different category where we're tweaking and our metabolic health is good. But somebody who is, like 600 pounds, type 2 diabetic, to me, it's a different scenario where if I'm in their shoes, I'm going to be looking at things like fasting, keto, maybe carnivore to jump back, at least to get to a baseline of where they're in a maintenance mode.
Yeah.
So just curious on, again, keto or other tools if somebody wants to do this quicker because they're feeling like they're in crisis mode.
Yeah. It's so interesting having been on, both in the sort of keto community through my work at Levels. There's a lot of people who are keto in that, but also having been really deep in the whole food plant-based movement. And it's like, I've actually seen massive changes like in both. And, and I think the reason I'm like, so I think, even though it might not sound so radical, like moving just to saying like today, I'm never going to buy ultra processed food again. I'm literally going to eat only things that are like whole foods that came from the earth, chicken, broccoli, steak, whatever it is. The reason that's actually so radical is because real food, and the reason I focus on quality is because it's going to have more nutrients in it to actually stimulate the nutrient sensing cells of the gut. They will trigger satiety mechanisms that basically get you to eat so much less. The more you put, the reason we're eating ourselves to death, literally in the United States, eating ourselves to death in the Western world is because our bodies aren't actually getting what they need. And so they're driving us to eat insatiably to basically give in hopes of the cells getting what they need to function properly. So if we can just kind of like, it is actually quite extreme and radical to just give the body, the cleanest, highest quality food possible, because it will essentially get you to radically change your hunger cues, I think, and change your microbiome, which then over the long term changes the way we interact with food. So, I would say for someone, they could go whole food plant-based, they could go carnivore. It's really, I think, where their inclination is, like, or somewhere in between, like I've heard of people eating literally, they were hundreds of pounds overweight. And they're like, I'm going to eat chicken breast and broccoli for every single meal for the next 2 to 3 months and like, lose a bunch of weight. Cause it's real food. I would not recommend that necessarily, but it's not like it has to be one extreme. I think that tightening the eating window for most of us, it's like 15 hours. So like finding a way to tighten that. But one key thing there is it's going to be easier to tighten that eating window if you're eating real food because you're going to be less hungry, right? And so and getting the insulin down. And so getting rid of all the processed sugar, all the processed grain, it's going to bring the insulin down, and that's going to let us tap into the fat stores that make fasting much less difficult. So yeah, I think some combination of time restricted feeding, maybe some extended fasts, eating real food, of really any dietary dogma, and checking biomarkers every few months for the first, as you're doing the initial entry point, like that's great. And if what's really nice is that there's a lot of services now that will deliver a lot of this food to you. If it's just too hard to think about preparing all this food for yourself, like if you're plant-based, you could buy all your food for a month from Daily Harvest, which is all organic, plant-based food, and put, a can of salmon on top of it. And like that's one way to do it. And then there's a lot of more like ketogenic meal plans that can deliver to your house and things like that. So there's ways to do it that kind of make it easier. But yeah, and then just trying to think, I think the other important thing to do in conjunction with that, if you can, is to think about the other aspects of your life that could be hurting the mitochondrial function and trying to pick a few of the highest leverage ones you can change. Because there's a lot of things that can hurt our mitochondria aside from the food. It's the not moving enough, environmental toxins in our lotions, shampoos, deodorants, cleaning products at home, the artificial light or not getting enough sunlight during the day. So really thinking about, okay, what else is blocking my mitochondria's capacity to make the energy I need to be metabolically healthy, and then chip away at those. And so some of those can actually feel, I think, a lot easier than changing the food at first and make you feel a lot better. So just like, one that costs money but doesn't necessarily take any like real effort is just like clean out all the products in your home that we know are endocrine disruptors, the scented candles, the air fresheners, the scented lotions, the scented shampoos, the makeup that's not non-toxic, the bleach, the cleaning supplies that are scented. Just change all those out. That will immediately help your mitochondria be freed up to do better work. So it's, one of the things in the book that I give to people is like quizzes at the end of the book to basically take stock of each of the factors of our lives that we know impact the mitochondria, see where there's the highest leverage room to improve, and then just start to pick a few things that are doable and accessible and easy to you to start cleaning up the environment for the mitochondria. And for many of those, it's a lot easier than changing our whole diet, but can have really, really positive impacts on our metabolic health.
That's a good point. And sticking with the toxin piece, I think we'd both agree the first step would be to go through the house and switch the products up like you mentioned. But for somebody that's been living that way with conventional products for say 20, 40 years, and they've built up all these toxins in their body, do you feel like there's another step there in assessing what's going on in the body and then detoxing, or just getting cleaner options in the house, switching the diet to a cleaner diet will be enough for the body to clear those out over time?
I mean, testing is always, I think, interesting. And there's like the small, medium, large level of testing that you can do, to start to assess. There are like functional medicine panels where you can really look at actually like, heavy metal exposure and various, pesticide exposure in the body. And I think that can be valuable. But I actually take a somewhat simpler approach, I think, to some of this, which is, the metabolic tests that we have talked about already are essentially readouts. They're like an MRI looking at all the things that impact mitochondrial health, like fasting insulin and glucose. These are kind of like the readout of how all the factors in our diet and lifestyle are affecting our mitochondrial health. So if those are off, I think we are going to want to do everything we can to clean up the environment for our mitochondria. So that's just kind of step one. I think I try and not, major in the minors. Like we know that our liver and our gut and our skin are like two ways that we can excrete a lot of the toxins and the damaging things in our body. So like step one, what can you do to support your liver health and what can you do to support your gut health so that you can like truly just start eliminating more of the toxins. And so that would be for liver support. I think some of the best things we can do that are so basic is, I hate to say it, but it's just like stop drinking alcohol. We're drinking so much in the US right now, and drinking rates increased during COVID. And that's a liver toxin. And the liver is where we do a lot of our excretion of toxins. So that's one. And then step two is eliminating like the added sugar, especially fructose, which comes in table sugar. It comes in liquid sugars like in sodas and high fructose corn syrup, because that is directly going to lay down fat in your liver. And then look at your liver function tests. Very cheap tests to do. AST, ALT, GGT, very cheap. And we want the liver to be super pristine as a way to eliminate toxins. And so in the book, I talk about how like, even though the standard ranges say like below 40s and 50s is good for AST and ALT, we actually probably want it less than like 17, like quite low, these liver enzymes, which is a sign that our liver cells are healthy. And for GGT, which is another protein that's made in the liver, we want that probably like lower than 14. Some studies say lower than 8. So that's a really good just like snapshot of how things are going with your liver. And then for gut function, it's just all the things we can do to protect the gut so that it can excrete a lot of these toxic chemicals. And so it's eating enough fiber. It's making sure that we're, getting rid of things that hurt the gut, like overuse of anti-inflammatory medications like Advil and NSAIDs, overuse of antibiotics. Refined sugar hurts the gut. Fructose hurts the gut lining. And just, supporting gut function with real food. So those are really basic, but basically it's just like taking out the big things that are hurting the main organs that help us get rid of the toxins, and then cleaning up the environment, such that we're like reducing the burden. And yeah, again, skin is largest organ in our body. So just making sure that the stuff we're putting on our skin is as clean as humanly possible. So
earlier when I talked about nutrition, I said we could look at it through getting micronutrients and different vitamins, minerals in, and avoiding the toxicants. We've added another piece since then, talking about the blood sugar. So I want to make sure that's clear. That's another whole dimension here where we want to get the nutrition the body needs, avoid toxins, and we want to do it in a way that's keeping our blood sugar in a healthy range. So there's 3 different layers.
Yeah, those are the 3 layers. That's exactly right. And I think, it's really like matching, the inputs, matching the cellular needs with the stuff we're putting in our mouth. That's step 1. Getting rid of the stuff that's overburdening and toxifying the body. That's step 2. And then doing it in a way that keeps our blood sugar hopefully more stable, because that's just going to make us feel better day to day, but also be good for our long-term health. And when we think about blood sugar, it's that actually gets broken down into a 2-part thing as well, which is that there are things we can do to control our blood sugar day to day, which is like walking after meals and making sure we're pairing our carbohydrates with fiber and protein appropriately, really balancing our meals. It can be things like adjuncts, like taking apple cider vinegar before our meals, which can lower our glucose spike. It's those types of like strategies for balancing our blood sugar. That's kind of step 1. And then the step 2 is actually building capacity of the mitochondria to process glucose better over time, which then will keep blood sugar levels stable sort of over the long run. So the blood sugar balancing piece has both the day-to-day and then sort of like the long-term building of capacity, which that is done through the multimodal, holistic dietary and lifestyle strategies that we've been talking about across all the different spectrums that essentially build the mitochondria's capacity to process glucose. So it's both the day-to-day and then the long-term of building a healthier mitochondria. So the nesting dolls of food, which is of course explained in detail in the book, but yeah, it's like we've kind of been, given this framework of like food is calories, and it is just so much more than that. And I think we have to remember that anything that's kind of been drilled into our head of like food, a calorie is a calorie and it's sort of calories in, calories out, that is a strategy that really like serves the food industry's interests over our own interests. Like knowing a little bit more and appreciating the magic of food for impacting all aspects of our cellular health helps us realize why it is so much more than calories. It's molecular building blocks. It's molecular information that directs our genetics and our cell signaling pathways. And then it's of course also the glucose level, which has an impact on our day-to-day function and our long-term health.
All right, Casey, we've gotten big into the food piece. We've covered toxicants. Let's move into some of these other high-level areas that we want to make sure we're looking at and addressing when it comes to metabolic health.
Yeah, well, I think so there's so many here. There's the movement, there's the sleep, there's the emotional health, there's temperature, there's light. I think if there's one that I think that I would say feels really accessible and very high leverage. It's the movement piece. And I think one of the things that surprised me in doing the research for this book was actually the power of reframing movement from the concept of exercise to the concept of, kind of just creating a life that's in motion. So right now we're very much subscribed to this idea that like exercise is a thing that we have on our to-do list. We schedule it into our calendar and we check it off and great, like we've done it. And that's kind of, I think, the mindset. And even with that, less than 28% of Americans are getting the recommended amount of exercise per week that we're supposed to. But there's actually, I think, an issue with that perspective, which is that it solidifies in our head that exercise is the discrete bout of activity that we do and then we're done. When you actually look at the biology of, human life, our cells actually do their best work when the body is kind of in motion, like all throughout the day. Like you look at tribal cultures that are still living today, that living very indigenous, sort of more traditional life. Some of them are walking 20,000 steps a day. The average American's walking 3,500 steps per day. We are really not moving. And something really astonishing is that we spend about 80% of our waking time just sitting, just not moving. And that has a profound impact on how our cells are functioning, because every time we actually contract our muscles, even if it's just like very low grade movement, walking through the house, walking around the house, walking in the garden, we're actually pushing glucose channels to the cell membrane. Muscle contraction does that. It pushes glucose channels to the cell membrane and keeps them there, absent of an insulin signal. So we're able to actually take glucose out of the bloodstream and use it and process it. But most of us are sitting 80% of the day, and then maybe we do the exercise at the end of the day or the beginning of the day. But the rest of the day, we're not giving the cells the signal to keep the glucose channels at the membrane. So we're creating this very stagnant biology that could be ameliorated just by low grade movement. You and I both right now are standing at our standing desk during this conversation, which activates core muscles, leg muscles, our glutes. So there is activity happening just by keeping ourselves upright that would not be happening if we're sitting in a chair. So I think it's actually a really hopeful message, because a lot of our health could get a lot better if we actually just maybe I think we should all be exercising 100%. But foundationally, we should all be moving a lot more throughout the day with simple, easy, low-grade activity. And trying to at least move a few times an hour, get up out of our chairs so that we can constitutively keep these glucose channels at the cell membrane to be able to let glucose into the cell to be processed by the mitochondria. The research has shown that there was actually a huge study in JAMA, one of the premier medical journals, that showed that just getting 7,000 steps per day, not even 10,000, just 7,000 steps per day, had the people who did that, compared to fewer than 7,000 steps per day, had 50 to 70% lower risk of dying in the 11-year follow-up period that they followed these people compared to the people who got less. So literally just walking 7,000 steps a day slashed your risk of dying from all-cause mortality by 50 to 70%. And there's been follow-up studies that basically show slightly different results, but like looking at people who got between 8 and 12,000 steps per day, that those people had, again, around a 50 to 65% lower risk of dying in the follow-up period than people who didn't get that amount. And then other studies have shown 40% lower Alzheimer's dementia risk, 40 to 60% lower risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes, lower risk of depression, gastric reflux, cancer. It's astounding. And I think it just goes to show, like, it doesn't need to be complicated. Like if this were a pill that lowered mortality by 50 to 75%, this would be front page news. But we have that. It's literally just walking. So we should absolutely be getting the resistance training. We should be getting our heart rate up. But at a baseline, we should just try to find ways to take some of our seated activities that we're doing normally and try and do them either standing or moving, and ideally outdoors. So an invitation I have for people is to just like really sit down and think about, like, how do I spend my days? Maybe I'm cooking, I'm with my kids, I'm with my partner, I'm going to I'm getting groceries, I'm working. how can you take opening mail, whatever it is, paying bills, how can I take some of those activities that I'm currently doing indoors and sitting and make them outdoors and standing or moving? So catching up with a partner, instead of sitting on the couch doing it, throw a football in the backyard or walk to the park. If it's opening mail, don't do it at your desk. Take it outside to a table and try and do it standing if you can. If you have meetings at work, see if people want to do a walking meeting outdoors. If you normally have Zoom calls, see if you can do it without video and take a walk while you're on the Zoom call. Get a treadmill desk on Amazon for $120. I'm sorry, a walking pad under your desk. They're now literally $120 to $150. You can easily get 10,000 steps in 2 to 3 hours walking at a super slow pace on the treadmill under your desk. Right now, a lot of us are buying our groceries on, Instacart or websites. We're not even getting out of our chair to buy our groceries. 150 years ago, most of us were growing our own vegetables. Then we moved to, farmers markets and sort of outdoor markets. Then we moved to indoor grocery stores. Now we just do it from our offices. So we've made it as sedentary as humanly possible. So think about maybe making that a task. Like, don't buy all your groceries online. Commit to going to the farmer's market once every 2 weeks if you can, outdoors and moving. So yeah, it's just really taking honest stock of those things and trying to make them a little bit more mobile, because it's not, there's not just lip service. It literally changes our cellular biology in a really positive way. And it's easy and simple.
You mentioned the walking pad there. I ended up investing in one of these about 4 months ago, and I rave about it all the time. It's been such a game changer. And of course, someone like me who's doing what I do and spending a lot of time on the computer, it makes sense it would be impactful. But for anybody who is working in an office space, like, it has been seriously such a game changer for me, and I love it.
Yeah. There's a stat in the book that is astonishing, and I unfortunately don't have it right in front of me, but they basically took 10 people in a workplace environment, and they had them use an under-desk treadmill for, I think it was just 2.5 hours per day for maybe 2 weeks. And the people lost 2.5 pounds of fat and gained like 2.5 pounds of lean tissue, so muscle, basically, during like a 2-week period. And so they didn't actually change their weight, but they changed their body composition. And this was just a couple hours at a low speed during the workday. So the paper extrapolated, and this has not been shown in the research, but they extrapolated that using a treadmill desk for a couple hours a day for a year could result in a 40 to 60 pound weight loss. And I just, that is very much like, would it increase people's hunger? Like, we don't know that for sure, but that was what their calculations they extrapolated to. So I think it's super valuable. And I'm like you, I'm always talking about my walking pad and how much I love it, because when I don't use it, I often, it's really hard to get those 10,000 steps. And when I do use it, it's like effortless. It just happens.
And in a way, it does kind of seem silly that we're talking about walking pads and like gamifying our steps. But the world is so radical we live in. Like, look at us here. We're connected from different parts of, 2 different countries. And you mentioned Instacart. Like, everything has radically changed in such a period of time that in this radical world, sometimes you need to do radical things like that to counterbalance. So I say embrace it.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not about like going back to the agrarian society where 90% of Americans were working in agriculture, which is like the way it was in the early 1800s. Like, the vast majority of people lived on a farm, and now less than 1% of Americans live on a farm. So it's like, that's probably not changing. But what we can change is sort of like to build back into our lives what modernity took away, and do it in a way that also allows us to do the work that we need to do, by just like modulating our environment through the lens of, what do my cells actually need? My cells need movement. They literally need movement. So how do I have my desk job while also giving my cells movement? And that is the responsibility we have to do. So step 1 is understanding, what do our cells need? What do our mitochondria need? And then step 2 is, in this modern world that I'm living in, how do I do that for them? And that's the journey. And it can be really fun, and it's not about creating a whole new lifestyle. It's about simple tweaks that give our cells what they need and stop them from being so overburdened.
Let's move into the stress piece. This is something that's a little bit more subjective, and a little less obvious when it comes to metabolic health. Talk about that connection there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I end my book with the talking about stress. And actually, the last chapter, which is my favorite chapter of the book, is called Fearlessness, the highest level of good energy. And I think that, so much of our world has changed, and we've talked about this a lot during this episode, but maybe the craziest thing about our modern life is the fact that we literally have the stresses and fears of 8 billion people being able to be streamed to devices in our homes and in our hands while we're laying in bed 24 hours a day. So the amount of information that is fear-inducing, stressful, catastrophic, wars, natural disasters, murder, everything, it's literally being funneled directly towards our brains and eyeballs. And this is like 10 years old. This is like brand new. Of course, we had newspapers and we had radio over the last, but it is a totally different level where we can literally see people being dismembered halfway across the world 5 minutes after it happens while we're laying in bed. And I think above almost anything, even the food, the 70% ultra processed foods that we're eating, this is totally unprecedented. And we are just getting absolutely crushed. I mean, the depression rates, the suicide rates, it's all going up. And it's like, well, yeah, of course. The world is petrifying almost like artificially in a way because there's bad stuff happening, but now it's all happening in our brains. So it's astonishing how much this is affecting our cellular biology, because more than just being a powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria it's got many other jobs. And one of the real jobs that it has is it helps coordinate cellular energy throughout the cell and throughout the body. So it's kind of like the motherboard that takes in all the environmental inputs and then says, like, how are we going to distribute resources in the body towards, rebuilding and thriving versus like defense and repair. And right now, the message the mitochondria is getting through our neurobiology, through our hormones, through our cortisol, through all the ways that these fearful, stress-inducing stimuli are basically translating into our biochemistry, the signal they're getting is that the world is profoundly unsafe. We are essentially at war all the time. And it is not a safe time to be alive, because that's what we're seeing all the time. And it essentially channels resources towards war and defense and alarm and chronic inflammation and all of this stuff. And so a big part of our metabolic health journey is actually finding ways to help our mitochondria feel safe from a psychological perspective, which means changing how we think, what we're seeing, and kind of being the parent for our 40 trillion cells and the thousands of mitochondria in each of those cells to say, like, I'm going to choose what I let in and what I don't. And I'm going to psychologically create safety inside this body so that you can do your best work and channel energy towards thriving and repair rather than defense and alarm. So that is each of our jobs as individuals, because no one can do that for us. We can have people help us because, of course, if you get a hug from someone you love, your body's going to secrete oxytocin, and that's a wonderful signal for your cells and your mitochondria. But fundamentally, this is our job. It's our job in setting boundaries. It's our job in understanding what is creating fear in our bodies and how do I limit that, and how do I use my thoughts to create biochemical safety inside my body. And that is just, we have to go down that journey because we are just getting crushed by the fear signals around us. And, during COVID, the CNN technical director was literally caught on an undercover camera saying, oh yeah, on CNN, if it bleeds, it leads. Like, fear-inducing media is what sells because we are biologically hardwired to pay attention to things that could be a threat to us. So if that TV's on and it's scary, we're going to want to watch it because there's something primal in us that says, I need to see this to protect myself. But you need to realize that this is a big industry manufactured charade. Like, of course, there's bad things happening in the world, but we have to protect how much of it we're letting into our bodies and be present enough to be able to sit in a park or sit with our kids or sit somewhere in the sunshine and say, oh yeah, actually, this day is very beautiful and I'm actually okay right now. and I'm not under threat right now, and we're good, and have that type of presence, because the world is trying to make you think that that's not the case. And it's also important to remember that if we are petrified, if we are existentially afraid of everything going on around us, we're going to seek the highly palatable foods that make us feel for a moment, feel a little bit better. We're going to seek the dopamine hits through all these things that are being kind of sold to us. And we are going to be consumers of more products to basically mitigate that existential angst. It's all a big game, and we have to basically create that safety for ourselves and create the boundaries to the fear-inducing messaging coming towards us. And that is actually a key part of our metabolic health journey.
And unfortunately, at this point in time, we have these messages coming at us, creating fear. We might be under artificial lights, sedentary by day, eating the ultra-processed food. And you can only imagine, as a human being, with all the different inputs and where we've gotten to as a society, which again adds up to that 93% number of being metabolically unhealthy. So I think first step is being real with where we're at, like we've done here. And then second step is sharing the hope, like we've done. And then third step is giving people the basic changes and tools, like we've done here. And underneath all this, there is a message of hope. We can change this. And awareness is the first step. And now people, throughout this conversation, your book, throughout a lot of different messaging online, fortunately, this messaging is starting to get through, and people have the power to change.
That's exactly right. I think that's the perfect take-home message. Yeah, it's our bodies are spectacular and are constantly evolving, and everyone, no matter where you're at, has the opportunity to feel better. I've seen incredible radical changes in so many people who have made simple changes. And I think, it's really about just like kind of understanding the truth, like you said, about what's going on inside our bodies, being really real about it, and then just taking small steps that feel accessible to start making some of these changes that protect our cells and mitochondria, because wins beget wins. So, something I share in the book is like, start with the things that there's a lot of strategies, right? To like help. There's the food, there's the sleep, exercise. It's a lot. It's overwhelming. So pick some things that feel doable, accessible, that you can really commit to, that maybe even feel fun, and commit to those, just a couple of them, because those will lead you to feel a little bit better, which will make you want to do more. And then it's just a virtuous cycle rather than a downhill cycle that we're kind of in. So definitely a message of hope, and love that you're spreading so much hope in the world, Jesse, with your podcast.
And you too, Casey. Thank you for the conversation. We're going to link up your social media, the new book, your website, everything in the show notes. And I just want to thank you for coming back on.
Thank you so much.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to head over here and catch this next incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
If you have a high fasting insulin, if you have excess abdominal fat, if you have high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL, low energy, frequent carb cravings, those are all signs of insulin resistance. Insulin and